The Chicago Digital Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup presents Testing for Accessibility on the Web with Katy Jones and Michael Berger.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for braving the rain. I know, like Dennis just alluded to, I didn't have to, so I feel very lucky, but I'm glad that you guys all made it out tonight. I'm Katy Jones. I'm a Senior Quality Assurance Engineer here at the Nerdery. I've been working in the accessibility realm for about 2 years as part of our accessibility team, among other things. Our accessibility team here at the Nerdery, we're super lucky because it's made up of people in design, front-enders, QA engineers, project managers, sales, anybody who might want to dip their toe into this realm and kind of learn more about it in order to better serve our clients. So that's super exciting, and I really love it.
As Dennis said, I am Michael Berger. I am part of the team at Basecamp. I've been over there for almost 10 years now. Got my start in customer support, and after a few years of seeing issues come in from customers that I felt like we could address before they were emailing us about them, I created our QA department, and more recently I have been getting into accessibility and bringing that to the company in the last year and a half. If you're not familiar with Basecamp, we are a maker of project management software, team collaboration. Most of our company is remote, but we have an office in Chicago just up the street from here. Just to get kind of a feel for the crowd here, do we have many software testers in the audience? Software testers? How about designers, developers? Cool, awesome. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Katy now, and I'll jump back in a little bit to talk about our process at Basecamp.
All right, so the first thing I just want to address is accessibility in general. How many people are familiar with the realm of accessibility and have worked in it before? Awesome, so looks about half and half, which is perfect. I'm just going to go over a little bit of the overview of it all. So web accessibility, in a nutshell, it's an effort to make the internet usable by everyone, and that includes people with disabilities. So in order to do that, we build our products to adhere to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. You may have heard it called WCAG. They're a set of guidelines that demonstrate how to construct an app or website to make it accessible. They're a long list of items that are constantly changing, they're constantly updating, so it's up to us to be able to make sure that we are familiar with those rules, know what they are, and continue to adhere to them. Another phrase you might hear a lot is Section 508. This is a section of the Rehabilitation Act, which was amended in 1998 by the Workforce Investment Act. That's a lot of words. That basically just means it requires federal agencies to develop information and communications technology that is accessible to people with disabilities. So when you hear about people getting sued, lawsuits, things like that, that's usually what people are referring to. Because accessibility is only a legal requirement for federal agencies or government entities. What we're hoping for is to see a shift in that tide. So the major disability types are visual, which is blindness, low vision, color blindness, that sort of thing. Hearing, deafness, hard of hearing. Motor, so inability to use a mouse, slow response time, limited motor control. And cognitive, so learning disabilities, high distractibility, inability to remember or focus on large amounts of information. These are all the things that we try to test to here at the Nerdery. So the purpose of what we do just basically is to evaluate apps and websites and tools so that they can be used by as many people as possible. And that includes people with disabilities. We just want to create a more inclusive internet. So what I'm going to be talking about are the tools and environments we use to achieve accessible products. So there are 100 different tools out there. Everyone uses different ones. We always talk about it here at the meetups, what everybody's favorite tool is, that kind of thing. So some are for design, some are for QA, some are for front end. But what I'm going to specifically talk about is what we use to test, so specifically QA, and what we do here at the Nerdery. So the first thing that we try to do is understand our user base. Webaim.org is a website that's dedicated to empowering accessibility. It conducts surveys to determine various statistics that we can build new rules off of. This can include changing which devices we test on, which browsers we recommend, and which tools we use, just dependent on what these survey results can be. So in the most recent survey, 75% of respondents indicated blindness, and 25% indicated visual impairments. So they tend to be the most common user type. This isn't limited to blindness or visual impairment. It can also include things like being colorblind. So because of that, the first tool that I'm going to go over is screen readers. Screen readers are programs that read the text of an app or a website to its user. They're usually independent from the site, part of the operating system, built in. Not only do they read the text, but when built properly and used properly, they can indicate whether a user is on a link or a drop-down menu, or it can describe a picture to the person that's using it. These are the 3 most popular screen readers that are used in the US today. They're JAWS, NVDA, and VoiceOver. In the Nerdery's full testing recommendation, we test on all of them. So I'll go over them individually. The first one is JAWS. It's one of the screen readers that does cost money. It is primarily used for Internet Explorer on Windows machines, so it happens to be a popular environment. It does cost money, which is kind of a bummer. And there is a demo available that people can use on their own and in their everyday life. However, it can't reliably be used in development or testing. It's even in their user agreement that you won't use it for testing. So unfortunately, it's not one that we can use here at the Nerdery without getting a license for it, which we happen to have, but it's hard to get clients on board with that, with that number. But luckily, there is another screen reader for Windows. It's called NVDA. It's primarily used in Firefox. It is worth noting that it only works after version 58 of Firefox. If you use it in anything before that, it just doesn't function properly and it'll give you issues. So we use this one as well here. The last one is VoiceOver. It's the native Mac OS screen reader. So it actually comes with every Macintosh that you have and every iOS device that you might have. It's most reliable in Safari. Obviously, Macs are more expensive than PCs, but when you're looking at JAWS sitting at that $900 mark, it does even out when you're making your own accessibility choices. Then there's mobile screen readers. So the most popular ones obviously are VoiceOver for iOS, and we have TalkBack for Android. VoiceOver is the one that everybody usually uses. It's the major one, but TalkBack over the past couple months has really been climbing in favor. Android is really going out of its way to prioritize accessibility and kind of get on the right track with their mobile devices. So that's been really exciting to watch. We don't currently scope that here right now, but we're hoping that as the tide changes that we're going to be able to introduce it to our suite. Oh, I should have mentioned, we're going to have tons of time for questions at the end. I know I'm kind of running through a lot of stuff really quickly. We're gonna do a nice Q&A at the end and make sure everybody gets a mic and gets to ask all their questions. So make mental notes. We also use a lot of automated tools here at the Nerdery. So the one that I use most frequently is Axe, and alongside it, Wave. They're just Chrome extensions. They're free. Anyone can install them in their Chrome. And they do high-level sweeps that call out like immediate issues on a website. So things like headers not being described by a screen reader, or alt tags are missing from a description. But it can also catch things like color contrast issues. So if there's if an image wouldn't be able to be seen by somebody with color blindness, the device will, or the extension will call that out, which is really good for us. But it's always worth noting that automated tools are really awesome and they're really fun to use and incorporate into your manual testing. But overall, they can't be 100% relied on. It's really important to continue doing manual testing alongside automated testing, just to be sure that you're really catching everything and really adhering to those guidelines. There are some websites out there that will offer an automated sweep and they'll give you like a number percentage of how well you passed, how close you are. And these sites can be really helpful in terms of just sort of giving you a ballpark idea of the types of things that you want to work on. But overall, they're just not really that accurate. They're going to have false positives in there. They're going to have some false negatives in there. There are a lot of things that make it more difficult to read the output and really rely on that. There are also some websites that will tell you, they'll give you an accessibility stamp of approval, a certificate. And frankly, that's just not really a thing. They'll give you, they might say, okay, right now at this point in time, everything that I looked at passes to 100% degree. And that's great. But as soon as there's a browser update or an OS update, all of that is basically useless. And you would have to run it again and again and again every time you do any sort of update to whatever your app or website is. And at the end of the day, that makes a certificate kind of pointless. It's something you can get, but it's just not long lasting enough. So making sure that you're staying on top of it and continually testing is really important. Oh yeah, and our last thing on there, we built a custom script in Python here at the Nerdery that basically just changes the output of Axe into like a more aesthetically pleasing thing. So it's not just like a long list of red flags, and it actually points out like where the issues are and how to fix them. So one of the things that you can use for automated tools is have it enhance your manual tools, which I am a big fan of. So some of our manual tools, one of my favorite ones to use is Frank DeLoop. It's an Apple app that lets you select color from anywhere on the screen, and it copies the hex code. So you don't have to like paste it into something to find out what the hex code is. You just click on it and it copies it right to your clipboard. So I find that really useful when I use Das Plankton, which is just a web tool, and you paste in your hex codes, and it tells you right away if the color contrast passes on AA or AAA. It also will look at things like your font sizes and stuff like that. So I find those two things super handy when just doing quick color contrast tests. The last thing that I like to use, it's another Chrome extension. I love my Chrome extensions. Is Color Contrast Analyzer. It's one of those things I was talking about earlier that will take a snapshot of the page that you're working on, and it'll call out where on the page there might be color discrepancies or issues, or where somebody with low vision or color blindness wouldn't be able to see what information is being presented. So there are, of course, users with disabilities other than visual impairment. So what we like to do is make sure that we're testing for everyone. So cognitive impairment, motor impairment, hearing impairment, we use several tests to address these potential areas as well. So this is kind of venturing out of the tool area and more into what we actually look for when we're testing, just so you can kind of get an idea of what we're trying to look for. So the first thing I like to talk about, because I think it is most often forgotten, is cognitive disabilities. So there are things like ADD, dyslexia, things that you might not first think of when you're programming a website. So during our testing process, we ensure that the content is sensitive to these needs. We look for things like flashing text, which can be really, really distracting. We look for timed elements. So, like when you're checking out on Ticketmaster and it's like, you have 2 minutes, otherwise you lose your spot. Like, we make sure that what we produce doesn't have anything like that. Obviously, there is a Venn diagram there when you're talking about security. Sometimes you need to have timed elements in order to stay secure. So we work with our security team here to make sure that we can do both things. So we also look for large blocks of text, which, I mean, a lot of you are designers in here. You know right away large blocks of text just aren't aesthetically pleasing in the first place. But they can also be really, really difficult for people who have dyslexia to be able to parse out the phrasing and the words that are there. And they're just not going to be able to get the right type of information that you want them to get out of it. The last thing that we like to look at are fonts. So we advise against using particular fonts, particularly fonts that are all capital letters. Those can be really difficult for people to parse out sometimes. Even serif fonts, so where the two letters are connected to each other, that can be really, really difficult for people who have dyslexia. So motor skills. In order to address motor impairments, we test to just make sure everything is accessible using only keyboard navigation. So a mouse isn't required for anything on the screen. That means that they're not only able to just see all the content on the site, but they're also able to interact with it using just a keyboard. So like being able to access drop-down menus, being able to click and drag, but using only a keyboard, things like that. Anything that doesn't require, or anything that normally would require a mouse, we try to make sure it doesn't. So in contrast, there are some users who use only a mouse and don't use a keyboard. Because of this, this isn't actually part of WCAG, but we have a best practice here, where we also make sure that everything on the page can be accessed using only a mouse. So we test on both sides of those things to make sure that we're covering both of those bases. It's just one of our best practices. Hopefully it'll be incorporated into WCAG in future iterations, but right now it's just something we look out for. Hearing impairment. So these are things that are actually pretty easy to look out for and to incorporate in that don't really require a lot of extra coding. For example, transcripts for any sort of video, any audio instructions, anything that you have should also have words next to it that describe what's going on, because at the end of the day, there's going to be people who are going to have a difficult time hearing those instructions or hearing that information. Another thing people tend to miss is multiple contact options. So if the only way to contact your business is a phone number, that might throw a lot of people off who normally use things like email or text or things like that. So having multiple ways for people to engage with your company and in your information is incredibly important. The last thing that is just something I like to point out is it's really not uncommon for sign language to be the first language for people who are hearing impaired, whether that be ASL or BSL or whatever it might be. So it's really important to use clear language. It's not that you have to dumb anything down or anything like that. It's just another way that you can keep accessibility in mind. And it's another way that doing things that encourage accessibility and adhering to accessibility actually help everybody and not just people with disabilities, which is one of the things I love talking about, temporary disabilities, which I think are most often forgotten. So oftentimes clients will ask us for a percentage of people with disabilities that'll be using their site, either to convince them to scope accessibility or just for their analytics on their side. They just like to know. And I can provide them with information like from WebAIM that I was talking about earlier. But at the end of the day, you can't really give a solid number because temporary disabilities exist. So for example, like maybe somebody broke their hand, so they're not able to use a mouse and they're going to be using keyboard with their other hand. Or maybe you had your pupils dilated and you don't want to look at a bright orange text on a screen, or maybe it's not even a disability. Maybe you're at the gym and TV's on and you want to be able to watch what's on there. And so you're looking at the captions. Like that's something people use captions all the time without necessarily needing to have hearing impairment. So I think it's really important to keep all of those scenarios in mind, because when you make the website, when you make the web accessible, when you make the internet accessible, it helps everybody in all circumstances. There's this myth that, oh, if it's accessible, then it has to be ugly. It has to be just text on a page so a screen reader can do it. And that's just not the case. You can absolutely make a beautiful, well-done website that is easy to navigate for every person that's using it, regardless of what their situation might be. So by considering all of these scenarios, we just come closer to achieving that. So right now, I'm going to pass it over to Michael, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about these real-world scenarios where you can apply these situations. There you go. There you go.
Thank you. All right. So, over the years, Basecamp's been around for a while, and we've created 3 completely different versions of Basecamp in that time. The most recent one is Basecamp 3, and this was launched in 2014. And then a lot of time passed, and 3 years later, in 2017, we started looking at accessibility. So it wasn't really that we didn't know accessibility was a thing until then. But as I'm sure many of you know, it's something that can be ignored pretty easily, especially for a company like Basecamp, whose ethos is all about building tools for ourselves. And because this wasn't something that was clearly affecting people developing the software, we weren't aware of it in that sort of way. So like many things at Basecamp, it often takes someone having a personal interest in a project in order for it to take shape and to progress and to happen. In this case, I was experiencing lulls in our QA process where I had nothing to do. And I would sit around feeling kind of bad about myself. What am I doing here? And while there are many things that I could have pursued, I had recently become kind of aware of the effects of a disability by way of my grandmother losing her vision progressively over time, and seeing how difficult that can be, especially for someone who's like an avid reader. And so this was kind of when I realized that this was something I should pursue. So I had some free time one day, and I decided just to fire up my screen reader, and I started tabbing around the page, and I immediately noticed how unclear some of these elements were. It didn't make sense to me how they were being described. And I narrowed in on one of them, and I did a bit of research, and then I opened a code editor, and I just started making some adjustments, and by golly, it improved the situation. And it created this feedback loop for me that was really rewarding, and I could then communicate to my colleagues how these things could be done. And so it just kept building from there. So to kind of give you a sense of our development process at Basecamp in general, we structure our projects into 6-week cycles. The teams are made up of one designer and 1 to 2 developers programming the feature. Once it's kind of settled, kind of what the design and the feature is going to look like, and it's kind of usable, they'll bring it over to QA, and and then my colleague Ann and I will evaluate the feature. We'll look for bugs. We'll kind of critique the usability and functionality of the feature. And most recently, we'll evaluate the accessibility. And all of this is documented in the form of to-dos in Basecamp within the project where we're working on the feature. The really key thing about this process is that incorporating the accessibility evaluation into this existing process that we had is what really allowed us to educate the rest of the team in a very gradual way on how to make things accessible and how to be aware of them. So this remediation has kind of been bilateral in approach. Basecamp is a really big app, and we have lots of platforms. Mobile web, we have different versions for iPad and iPhone and Android. We have both small mobile views. We have those native apps. In addition, we have desktop clients now. And as I suggested earlier, we shipped a lot of features in the 3 years before we were paying attention to accessibility. So we're able to address accessibility in all of our new features during QA. And this has allowed us to ship all new features in a very accessible way since we started doing this a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. Time flies. The other side of the equation is writing pitches, which are kind of messages in Basecamp, kind of making a case
for why a specific feature should be made accessible. So these are things like time pickers and combo boxes and other sorts of very complex widgets that that really need to be rethought in order to be accessible. And so, you know, we're slowly kind of working through this backlog, but it takes time. So what I want to show you all now is a recent project that was very challenging from an accessibility perspective, how we approached it, and finally how it turned out at the end. So this is a hill chart. As many of you notice, it's a very visual interaction. The dots each refer to a to-do list within the project, future applying edits, global recurring events, and permas per occurrence in this example here. The left side of this chart, labeled figuring it out, represents the problem-solving, uncertainty, and unknown stage of the work, while the right side of the hill curve is labeled making it happen. So this is all about execution. So what happens is you drag a dot or more than one dot to kind of reflect where you feel that grouping of to-dos is currently at in terms of process. And you can add an optional note to kind of describe it, and you save your update. This is another look at the hill charts. This is the history view. So you can see here we have several updates. There's notes, and over time, you can see kind of how has this to-do list progressed through each update. So when I realized that we were working on this feature, and I knew that unless I really got in there, it was not going to be accessible. The first thing that I do in this sort of situation is I go to the W3C pattern library, and it's the World Wide Web Consortium. They have this index of elements, and what you can kind of do is think about, well, I'm looking at this feature we're developing. How might it correlate to any of these items? So what I felt was most appropriate in this case was a slider. It kind of, the interaction is like a slider, or perhaps that would be a good way to interact with each dot on the curve. This is definitely a great resource. And when you go here, you can actually play with each element. So this is an example of those sliders. And if you turn on your screen reader, you can hear what is being described. And it just is a really great example to use as a reference. They also provide all of the keyboard interactions that are expected of that sort of a element, along with the roles and properties and states and other attributes that you would use to achieve it. So I took all of that into consideration, and I put together a very lengthy document for the team, kind of describing how each of those viewing and editing states would optimally work for someone using a screen reader or keyboard navigation. I talked about the language. For example, as a visual user looking at this curve, it's obvious that the stuff on the left is moving to this peak in the center, and then stuff on the right is moving down. Not at all the case if you're a non-visual user. So we had to consider how to succinctly communicate all of that, plus how far along each of these to-do lists were in a non-visual way. So now I'm going to go ahead and just open the browser here and show you how it turned out. All right, so here's our hill chart demo project. Zoom in a bit there. Okay, so this lives in the to-dos section of the Basecamp project. It's right at the top of the page here. So we'll go ahead and turn on VoiceOver and hope the volume is not too loud.
VoiceOver on Safari. 2, to-dos, window, 2, to-dos, the content has keyboard focus. You are currently on web content.
How's that volume? Should we turn it up or is it good? Up, okay, let's see.
Close button. Audio output volume low button. Volume up, volume up, volume up button. You are currently on the button. Close button. Volume down button.
Okay,
Close button.
that's probably
Close
good.
button.
All right, so
Main help 5. 5 view is fill chart. This chart view is fill chart. This chart plots the progress of each to-do list on a bell curve. Lists moving up the hill are being figured out. Lists moving down the hill are being finished off.
so this is the first element that you land on within the hill chart area, and it very clearly described to someone using a screen reader what this element is without occupying space on the screen. So if you're looking at it, you wouldn't necessarily need that. The next element here, this describes, this is a link to view historical updates and describes that in addition to when it was updated. So now we'll go ahead and tab onto the first dot here.
Visited link. The to-do list social stuff is 56% up the hill. You are currently on link.
And so, yeah, so it described where it was at on the chart, on the hill, in a percentage sort of way.
Visited link. The to-do list background and research is at the top of the hill. You
We
are currently on link. To click this link, press Control, Option, Space.
we special case the language to describe like at the top of the hill. So over here is up the hill, top of the hill.
Visited link.
This one here is down the hill.
You are currently on link. To click this link, press Visit, update the
And now we'll go ahead and jump into the edit state here.
Use the sliders to adjust the position of each dot on the chart. You are currently on
So again, visually, we write that you can drag each dot to adjust its position, but we've replaced that with a non-visible prompt for the screen reader user to say that you would use the sliders to adjust the position of each dot on the chart. So we'll go ahead and tab onto the first dot, and it should describe how we're going to interact with it.
Social stuff is 56% up the hill. Slider, updating the hill chart. Group. You are currently on a slider. To start interacting with the slider, press Control, Option, Shift, down arrow.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Thank you. All right, so we're in the slider now, and
social stuff is now 58% up the hill. Social stuff is now 60% up. Social stuff is now 62% up the hill.
and you can just move these however you want.
The to-do list background and research is 0%. The to-do list iOS app is the to-do inside. Background and research is now 20% down the hill.
All right, and then if you want, you can add a little update.
Details about your changes. Today, exclaim.
All right, I just wrote great progress today, and then we'll go ahead and save this update. Okay, I'll just show you one more thing here. Let's just take a look at this historical view. So I'm going to go to, so I just clicked on the background and research dot here. And so this is going to take me to the history just for that specific to-do list.
Skip to main content. Main. Quick nav. Click the 5. Chart. This chart.
So you'll see we have 2 dots now labeled with dates for this to-do list.
Visited. Link. This to-do list was at the top of the hill on Monday, August 6th. Link. This to-do list was 20% down the hill on Tuesday, August 7th.
And so what it's describing there is it knows that we're on this particular to-do list. We've navigated into that. So we have a clear sense of context. And so we don't want to say background and research repeatedly in this case. It's better just to say this to-do list, because we're only looking at one to-do list on this particular screen. And we're conveying kind of the progress in that sort of way. So that is the hill chart and how we made it accessible. In this case, it took quite a bit of time. A good additional week was spent on this project in order to get it to be accessible. But the team learned a lot, and everyone felt really good about it. Oh, we can turn off voiceover now. All right. So I guess the thing that I just wanted to touch on to wrap it up here is that it can be very challenging to implement this sort of thing into your process, and especially to convince the people around you that it's worthy of the time. You know, I recently had to kind of remind everyone, you know, why this is important and why it's good to spend time on. And like Katy was saying earlier, like it really is about like a human right. You know, do we believe that everyone should be able to use the web equally? And when you think of it in such simple terms like that, it really resonates, I think. We've had tastes of success, and it just continues to get better and better. But it's, you know, more than anything, been a really great adventure so far. So with that, I think we'll jump over to like a Q&A. Yeah. Do we have any?
Yep.
Yeah, I think so.
Just need to pop it on.
Yes. I have the first question.
Okay.
I got the most wet. So you were just mentioning it. This question will actually be for the both of you. So you just said you had to remind the developer in regards to getting people motivated to code right and design right.
That's a good question. You know, it's you know, fortunately, Basecamp is a small team. It's we're 50 people, and the company is very supportive of kind of like the right way to do things, so to speak. I mean, you know, we're all about like work-life balance and kind of like progressive sort of practices like remote work, you know, which is becoming less progressive, but we're kind of doing that before it was cool. And so I think when you have that kind of freedom, people just want to do it because they feel like it's good and it's the right thing to do. And when you look at like a before and after, and you demonstrate to the team like this is how poorly this interaction works before we spend the time to make it accessible, then it's pretty compelling, you know. It really reinforces it.
Yeah, absolutely. We have an amazing team that's really dedicated to it, constantly learning, that sort of thing. But obviously, we're lucky. Not all situations lend to it being easy to convince people to do these sorts of things. I find internally, when I'm trying to get somebody excited about it, I like to talk about how it can make coding more creative. It can hone your skills a little bit more in ways that maybe you wouldn't have thought about. And also, it's where the industry is going. So if you as a developer want to stay ahead of the curve and stay an asset to your company and this industry, knowing accessibility is incredibly important. So knowing that you can expand your portfolio with it is a good way to talk, at least in my experience, to talk to developers about it. You're talking to clients, you just talk about how they're going to get sued, and that's easy. Then they're all about it. But normally clients are on board, and they just don't know much about it. So I find that educating them just about what accessibility is and what, like, just doing a little half-hour introduction to it really gets clients on board with where the initiative is going. It's just taking a little bit of time to explain.
Open up for questions. Now this is where I get my steps in.
I have two questions. So one is the Python script that would beautify the logs. Is that open source?
It is not right now, but it is something that we're working on doing.
Okay. The second question is, are there any websites or like an app that will make someone who is, help someone who is not disabled get an experience what it's like to be disabled.
No,
Kevin?
I don't have any specific sites. I really think it's just about familiarizing yourself with the tools because they're really easy to install and they have instructions. They're just quick and you can just pop them right on Chrome and you just go to a website, click that color Chrome or analyzer, and it'll spit out something that you can look at and analyze on your own. And that gives you that experience. If you want to learn about like screen readers or things like that, obviously they're a little bit more complicated and will take some more training dedication. But there are plenty of tools out there that you can employ just to sort of see what it's like. In terms of examples.
I was thinking, you know, like there are some really good books that talk about kind of, I don't know, that just kind of expose you to the variety of disabilities and kind of just like being in it and reading them and it just like kind of, it helps you empathize, I guess. I also found that like just there was this like imagined learning curve with the screen reader, and many of them are still very complicated screen readers, but the very basic interactions, especially with something like VoiceOver, are pretty simple. There are some simple tutorials online. We can share them afterward on the page or whatever. But just, you know, simply like learning the key combination to navigate elements using the screen reader and like closing your eyes, you get you very quickly see that what it's like, I think. Yeah.
Just as an addition, one of the other things I like to do screen reader wise, instead of closing my eyes, is I will unplug my monitor because then I can't cheat and open my eyes if I don't know where I am. You know, it really forces you to learn that experience as somebody who wouldn't be able to see the screen.
There's one more cool one that came to mind, was like, I think for like Accessibility Awareness Day, I encouraged everyone on our team to not use a mouse or to like cover their trackpad and see what it's like to use keyboard navigation. Specifically in Basecamp was what I encouraged, and some tried it out.
Hi, sorry. A lot of times in my team, we are becoming more aware of it, but we always like catch it too late, and I feel like, and we're trying to catch it ahead of time, but we never have time to like get to it. So like, oh, we'll do it in that sprint, or we're going to make a sprint just about accessibility, but it like gets loaded up. So, and then we just don't have the right attention, I guess. Did you find yourselves getting caught in that when you first started, at least being more aware that, you know, you have this deadline for this app to be released, but now you care about accessibility, but you didn't scope that in? I guess how do you mitigate that?
Yeah, it definitely happens, especially early on. Like I just started making like to-dos and thinking that people would just like decide to do them. It doesn't really work that way so often. So, you know, kind of, I think I like slowly introduced levels of accessibility consideration to our process. So kind of maybe, and it kind of correlated with my understanding of accessibility. So like there were things that I wasn't really aware of in those early days. And so we were focusing on certain things like making sure that, you know, things were labeled properly and contrast and very basic things. And then like as our expertise in understanding accessibility has increased, so has the desire to do it properly. But the real key has been to incorporate it during development, and it's challenging for sure. But like once someone's been on a few projects and they've made them accessible, I think slowly they become aware of how to just do that from the start. You know, because that's really what a lot of it is. It's just like doing these things instinctively.
Yeah, I can definitely add on to that. From my perspective as a QAE here, I have just forced myself into design meetings and client meetings that are really early in the process. As soon as one comes down the pipeline, I'm like, I'm going to that just so I can listen and kind of figure out what their idea is going to be, and then maybe call out red flags on like a more casual basis with the designers or the devs. Right now, I'm on this fantastic project where they invite me to each of their XD UX meetings and walk through everything like step by step, and I can say, okay, that's not going to work, and okay, we're going to have to move this here, and oh, make sure that you put this tag there. And I'm just able to kind of give a more like an in-depth view prior to it becoming developed. And then when you can catch it that early, and of course that does take time, it takes somebody's budget out, like they're going to have to be there at those meetings. But it saves so much time later down, like to the point where you might not even need a whole sprint for accessibility if you have somebody audit something early on and just kind of give their feedback before it even gets into that level, if that makes sense.
Okay, next question is behind the pillar.
Hello.
So for a team that has not considered this at all, so for all practical purposes, we haven't audited anything, we're at 0. Do you have suggestions to get to like 50%, 70% first as we're getting used to it?
It's, you know, I would say maybe focus on a platform to start. You know, it can quickly become overwhelming when you're trying to address like web and also Android and also iOS. So that's definitely a helpful scope. I would say that like introducing the automated checking into the process would be really useful, just because it highlights these things that that are very easy to fix, in the sense that like when you run these scripts, they flag a certain element, and they'll tell you what's wrong with it, and they'll link you to a page that explains how to fix it. And they're easy to fix most of the time. So I think that would be a great start. And then also just like kind of focusing on what are the most like fundamental interactions in the product and trying to prioritize making those accessible. Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to start.
I have nothing to add. That was perfect. Yeah, but just to reiterate, using those automated tools are so easy. They're just Chrome extensions. Click a button and you can take a look. In terms of just like an easy way to start, that's definitely what I would encourage.
One other thing you could consider would be either you know, like checking out some of these books about accessibility, or perhaps bringing someone in to do a workshop who would kind of give everyone both an introduction to like what is this all about, and also the kind of build that empathy, I guess, or that value of it. You know, help people see why it's important to then get everyone's buy-in. Yeah.
In terms of the issues of aging itself, because America is an aging population, and the future users of the web will be just more and more older adults.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have things in the WCAG guidelines, in the web content guidelines, that are specific to that. I didn't cover them specifically here because they usually fall under some of the other umbrellas. So for example, the low vision, the low hearing, but we also make sure, just to your point, that magnifying works properly. So if you magnify a page to 500%, you're still able to access everything on. We also have limits on button sizes on phones, so they don't have to hit small, small targets, because there's motor function impairment as well. So that is absolutely something that's incorporated within those guidelines. We're always welcome to hear more, though. Absolutely.
One thing that comes to mind just from like personal experience is that the elderly population now is in such a different position than I think like they will be in however many years, that people are exposed to technology. You know, like trying to teach someone who's never used an iPad, how to like use a screen reader is like a pretty difficult task. Whereas I think that like the population now it'll be easier to use those tools. Yeah.
One of the issues that I
Oh,
encounter.
well, use the mic. Yeah.
One of the issues that I frequently encounter as I work with my patients is really not necessarily like how to use this, but even just approaching the technology is already intimidating to them. So I'm wondering if there's a way to like make it feel like, oh, this is really easy to use, very user friendly, and would accommodate whatever disabilities they have.
I think some like dedicated products can be useful. Like, for example, like a hard, I mean, I don't know, like it's tough in terms of web technology and technology in general, like, yeah, like making computers and smartphones easier for them to use. But, you know, there are certainly products that could be useful to that population. Like, for example, like there's like a really cool audiobook, like book on tape product that like the like Library of Congress or something offers, that, you know, it's like a digital book player, but it's like very simple to use and single purpose, you know. And other things like digital magnifiers that aren't like built into the computer, but more so have like a physical button to use, you know, can be kind of less of a learning curve potentially. Yeah. Hi.
Hey guys, I love the tools that you're giving us. Thank you for those. But and maybe I missed it earlier on in the talk, but I was wondering, how often do you actually test with people who actually have disabilities and are blind or deaf, have a cognitive disorder? What does that look like for you at your respective places?
At Basecamp, we haven't gone there quite yet. We don't do a great deal of user testing in general, although it is something that we do want to pursue. And this would be another part of that. I think my excuse or whatever it would be like kind of like a time thing, like making the time, going through the process of I know there are organizations to recruit testers and to help you along with this process. So it's definitely something we'd like to do. And I've heard just incredible things about the benefit. The other thing that I'd want to make sure when pursuing that is that what I'm seeing, I can make sure is really clear to the rest of the team, you know, because part of it is like, I already know like a lot of these issues. But I think being able to make sure that what we're seeing when people are using it can really resonate with the rest of the team who isn't there at this session or whatever.
Yeah, I think like just the base answer is not enough. We also don't do a lot of user testing. We do have some members of the Nerdery staff who have various disabilities that will run things by. And they're not testers, but they can be sort of last minute user testers we can throw in to take a look at the sort of things that we're building and make sure that they function. The Nerdery's accessibility department was started in Bloomington by a team of people with disabilities. They have all since moved on from the Nerdery, but all of the best practices that we have were passed on from them. So even though we don't have anybody on our team currently, it is something like in our ethos, and exactly like Michael said, always something that we're attempting to incorporate as much as possible moving forward.
We have time for one more question. You raised his hand.
Thanks. When you're working with a complex or one-of-a-kind feature like the graph, for example, how do you decide when your solution reaches a good enough point? And how do you, I guess, justify like the marginal expenditures in incorporating features?
You know, it's interesting. It's not like all in my. It's like this. It's this thing where as time passes and the most significant things have been taken care of, I'll just kind of like, the team needs to move on to the next feature, and I'll kind of just let it go. I don't know that there's such a clear line. Sometimes I'll, for example, like with the hill chart, we still have some brokenness with like the keyboard. If you were to be using it as like a keyboard user without a screen reader on, like when you have the screen reader on, when you tab onto those hidden sliders, it's clear because they're announced. But because the location of those sliders is like kind of off the page, I don't know if anyone noticed, but like there wasn't a box around the dot when they were being manipulated. So like that's something that I know is still broken, but the person who was working on the feature is like on other stuff right now. So I kind of just like leave it in the back of my giant list of things to do one day, and hopefully we'll get to it. But I think it comes down to like, can is it reasonably usable in this state for your target user, I guess.
So I can't really speak to building a particular feature like that because I don't build anything. But when it comes to measuring what's good enough, and like that's something that we have to ask ourselves literally every day. It's like, okay, we're running out of budget. How do we measure, like, is this going to be okay? And, really, you either pass or you don't. There isn't really like a percentage that you are like, that you're adhering to these guidelines. What you really do have to keep in mind, though, is anything blocking a user from using this? Is it just annoying, or are they absolutely not able to use it at all? And if a user is not able to use it at all, then that's something that's high priority and you have to fix. If it's something that's just irritating, but they can work around, for example, not having a skip to main content link, okay, they have to scroll through all the stuff at the header. That's super annoying, but they can still access everything that's on the site. So that's sort of how we prioritize here, is making sure that users are still able to access every piece of information that they should be able to access.
I want to thank Kathy and Michael for a great Katy. Sorry.
It's so funny.
This is why I have assistant organizers. Thank you, Katy. Thank you, Michael, for a great presentation. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to stop up.
Yeah, and also stop up or get in touch via email or Twitter or whatever. We're happy to chat. Yep. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks to our presenters, Katy Jones and Michael Berger. Follow Katy on Twitter at prepaidpanic. Email Katy at kjones@nerdery.com. Follow Michael on Twitter at Bergatron. Email Michael at michael@basecamp.com. Thanks to our venue host, The Nerdery. Visit them online at nerdery.com. Live captions are provided by ACS, Alternative Communication Services. Visit them online at acscaptions.com. Live captions sponsored by McDonald's. We're loving it. This recording has been a production of the Chicago Digital Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup. Visit us online at meetup.com/A11YCHI. Follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/A11YCHI. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/A11YCHI. Subscribe to and watch recordings from past events on our YouTube channel. Just search for Chicago Digital Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup.